Good afternoon and welcome here in the Blauwe Zaal to this Studium Generale program on the topic of optimism. Well, like Monty Python already advised us many years ago, always look on the bright side of life, which is of course great advice, but how could we interpret this advice scientifically? Bless you. What is optimism exactly? Where does a positive or a negative view of the world come from? And is optimism something that you could learn? Well, our speaker of today is a true expert on this topic. She is a professor in experimental health psychology at Maastricht University. And with her research group, she studies the influence of positive thinking on health, particularly in relation to developing and coping with chronic pain symptoms. What's quite remarkable is that she is identifying mechanisms by which positive thinking could provide protection against illness. So, very curious to hear more about that. Please join me in welcoming Professor Madelon Peters.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction, and welcome everybody. And it's actually great to see so many of you here. We have almost a full house, so that's really nice. So indeed, in the coming half hour, I'm going to talk about optimism, a topic which fascinated me for a long time already. So I think I've been studying it for 10, 15 years, besides other topics like chronic pain. And so it's really pain and pleasure, which I'm interested in. Before I start my lecture, I first have a question for you. So who would consider himself or herself being more on the optimistic side than on the pessimistic side? So please raise your hand if you think so. Okay, that's quite some people. And who would identify him or herself more on the pessimistic side? Okay, also quite some people, but less so than optimism. And in fact, that parallels what we have found in large surveys in Western countries. So that's what you see here. Optimism is being measured with a questionnaire. So you're not either an optimist or a pessimist, but you can be somewhere in between, of course. So there's the dimensional. And here, what you see here at the white arrow, that would be the midpoint of optimism. And as you can clearly see here, most people are on the right side, so this is more extreme optimism, this is extreme pessimism, so most people are more on the right side. So over the board, you could say, in general, people tend to be more optimistic than pessimistic. Of course, not everyone. But this is from Europe. If you look at the world, actually, there has been a very large survey, I think it was already in 2013, and where they surveyed the level of optimism across 140 countries. And even across the whole world, you could see that most countries, on average, people scored higher than neutral on the level of optimism. So also in other countries, and also non-Western countries, mostly people are more optimistic. There was just one country, and in 2013 that was Zimbabwe, which scored below the midpoint of optimism. But you can also see here that there are differences between countries. So the lighter the color, the more optimistic. And as it's very apparent here, it's mostly the Western and the more wealthier countries where the level of optimism is highest. But nevertheless, even if it's a bit lower, it's still above the midpoint. Okay, what actually is optimism? There are many definitions of optimism, but I will show you here one definition of what an optimist is by the American Psychological Association. And it actually says that optimists are people who anticipate positive outcomes, whether serendipitously or through perseverance and effort, and who are confident of attaining desired goals. What it actually says is that optimists in general, across all life domains, rather think that things will turn out okay. It's not that you always think in every circumstances, but generally you think, okay, it will be good later on. And also, it's not necessarily because of your own doing. It can also be because you have help from others, that fate is beneficial for you, or that maybe God helps you. So whatever the source, you think everything will turn out right in the end. So again, there's a dimensional. Some people are more optimistic than others. So what is actually where does it come from? Why is this difference there in optimism? So one obvious reason is genetics. So another question for you. Who would think that it's genetically determined, optimism? It's a few people, but not many of you. Well, in fact, there is a genetic component, but it's not 100%. Of course, it's not 100%. And twin studies, where they compared identical twins with non-identical twins, identified that about 25% of our level of optimism is genetically determined. So the rest comes from somewhere else. And what is this somewhere else? Well, it's mostly early life experiences. So it's your upbringing. So, for instance, modeling by your parents. If your parents react very optimistic to stressors, you probably are influenced and take that in. And also you are more prone to act more optimistic in such circumstances. But also your early life experiences, whether you encounter adverse events or hardships. And for instance, this was a study from Finland, where they interviewed people with different levels of optimism and retrospectively asked them about the early life experiences. And the more childhood adversities they experienced, so like financial problems, but also very traumatic events like sexual abuse, and the more of these circumstances, the lower the level of optimism, which makes, of course, sense. But also the parent-child relationship. Having a good relationship with your parents protected against the negative effects. So the more optimistic people were if their bonding with their parents was good. It was best if there's a good bonding with both parents, and if it was with one parent, it's already protective. With two parents, a good relationship with two parents was even more protective, or encouraging your level of optimism. Okay, so most people are on the optimistic side. It is determined by genetics and early life experiences, but does not say that it cannot change. And I will get back to that later. So is it beneficial to be optimistic? I think we could say yes to this question, because 3 decades of research already has shown many beneficial effects. For instance, on social relationships, what we find is that optimists have more stable relationships with their spouses, and also they have a larger social network. And this kind of research is sometimes done cross-sectionally, so you measure it at the same point in time, but also longitudinal research, where you measure the level of optimism on a certain time point, follow up people, and see how they're doing years later. And with that kind of research, also has been found that the higher the level of optimism, the more successful people are in their studies, so in their educational life, higher attainment of grades when they start studying, but also in their professional life, so making better promotions. This is especially done in the United States, so I cannot say that it's across all cultures, but at least in the United States we see this association between higher levels of optimism and making more promotion in your work. Importantly, and I will devote some time to that later on, is that it's also protective against stress. If you think everything will turn out all right in the end, you can imagine that your feelings of stress will be reduced, that you don't react that much to a stressor, both subjectively, how you experience it, but also more physiologically, so your body responds less to stress. And also, when people encounter a hindrance or a barrier, if you're more optimistic, they tend to persist and put more effort into attaining their goals still. So even despite some problems, they try to hang on and try to attain what they want to attain. So, we also call that active coping. So they're not passive copers, that they turn to emotion-focused coping, but they're more actively coping with the circumstances. And that is where I will devote most of the time to. There's also health benefits. Marla already told you, I'm a health psychologist, so that's mainly interested me. How does optimism impact on our bodies, and do we indeed have health benefits from it? So that's where I'm now going to focus on. This is a paper which appeared in the journals in 2019. This is from The Guardian, but it appeared in many papers, newspapers across the whole world. Also in the Netherlands, for instance, Trouw had a large cover story about it. And it says, you can read it, optimism may hold the secret to longer life, study suggests. And also that research claims people who look on the bright side stand better chance of reaching 85. And where does it come from? Well, this was actually based on a large-scale study, which was done in the same year in the United States, where they followed a large group of women, 70,000 women, which were followed for 10 years. So their level of optimism was measured. Then they were followed for 10 years, and the age of dying was assessed. And of course, they started out with already a bit of an aging population. You can understand if you are interested in mortality, that you don't start out with children, but already with a little bit older age. And also a group of men, smaller group, 1,500, were followed up for 30 years. So it were two databases which were aggregated and were looking at this association between optimism and longevity. And if you compare the 25% of lowest optimists with the 25% of highest optimists, they found a 10 to 15% increase in lifespan for the more optimistic group. And they also specifically looked at whether you can live longer than 85, what's called exceptional longevity. And they found an odds ratio, so an increased chance of living to that age from 1.7 times. So you have 1.7 times higher if you're very highly optimistic compared to highly pessimistic. So what could be the reason for that? There's no magic in that you are optimistic so you live longer. So there must be a reason. And of course, one of the most prominent reasons you could think of is that it also has to do with your health behaviors. If you eat more healthy, if you exercise more, smoke less, that's all related to a longer and healthier life. And other studies indeed have found that living a long life is related to, that optimism is related to better life circumstances. And I will go into that later. But first, this was not the only study. There are many more studies showing this association between optimism and longer life. Because in the same year, this was a meta-analysis where they aggregated the results of several studies. And so all the squares here are the studies themselves. So these are the original studies. And they looked at the association between optimism and mortality or longevity. And if you're here in the green side, there's a positive relationship between optimism and longevity, or negative between optimism and mortality, you could say. If you would be on the right side, in the red, it would mean that if you're more optimistic, that you die earlier. Well, as you can see here, fortunately, they're all on the green side, except maybe for this one, which has did not find an influence. The square here, rather the diamond here, is the aggregated effect. And this was a significant effect, meaning that indeed, across all these studies, there was this positive association between optimism and longevity, or reduced mortality. Here they're looking at all-cause mortality. They did the same thing for specifically dying from cardiovascular disease. And there, the association was even bigger. So this is actually not such a big association. It's small to moderate. But if you specifically look at dying from cardiovascular diseases, there is really a moderate association, so larger than the one found here. So then again, back to this aspect of health behaviors. Indeed, other studies have tried to control for health behaviors, but this study, okay, so these are the health behaviors which might impact, but this study, which was actually a follow-up of the previous one with the large-scale study, but here they looked at 150 women. There were only women in this study, and they looked at how much of this relationship between optimism and longevity was determined by health behaviors. So they measured a lot of health behaviors, and they could see a mediating effect, whether indeed it was because of these health behaviors. And what they found was that 24% of optimism, of the effect of optimism on mortality or longevity was determined by your health behaviors. So there is still a large amount which is not explained by health behaviors. And also, they also controlled for things like current health status, family income, education, because you can also think about social economic status, which is also to do with mortality and longevity. And that optimism and social economic status might also be impacted or also be related, so they controlled for that as well. And still there was a lot of unexplained variance which did not come from these health behaviors on for social economic status. So what might be the other mechanisms? And there we come back to the stress. It makes sense. If you think, okay, I'm in not so nice circumstances at the moment, there's a lot of stress around me, but in the end, tomorrow, next week or next year, it will be better, that it might affect you less. Even if objectively the same stresses are around you, if your perception of the stressor is that it's not so long-lasting and that it might go away, then you are might be less impacted by that. So there's a lot of research more on a subjective level where people fill in questionnaires and we see this relationship. But it's even more interesting, of course, to see whether people physiologically react to the stressor. And this has been done as well in laboratory studies. So a very well-known stressor in psychology is public speaking. That's the thing I'm doing right now. So we use that in our labs as well. So this is a poor student who has to give a lecture in front of 3 people who are not very nice. I mean, I look at your faces and you look quite interested, but those people, they look stern, they were not nodding. So it was really made as a kind of social stressor that you don't feel at ease in this circumstance. And in such circumstances, if you don't feel at ease, you might produce stress hormones like cortisol. And that's what it looks like. So here the stressor takes place, and when the stressor starts, people start producing stress hormones, which peaks around 15 minutes after the stressor, or after the stressor has begun. And so it takes a little time to produce these hormones. And then, if the stressor is gone, they go away again. So they did this with students. They measured the level of optimism and looked at how optimism influences this stress response on the level of hormones, stress hormones. And what they actually found was that the more optimistic, the faster the decrease in the stress hormones. So people did produce stress hormones, but when the stressor was gone, they went back to baseline faster. So it isn't that long in your body, and it doesn't have the negative effects on your body. And because long-term effects of stress hormones in your body, it doesn't matter if it's for a short term of time, but if it's prolonged and or very frequent, it might affect many of your organs. So it looked a little bit like this if you look at the most. Well, this is a graph I made myself, so it's not the actual findings, but it looked a bit like this, so that it declined faster in the most optimistic people. Right, but of course, stress hormones, they can impact your health, but not only longevity and mortality rate. There's more to health than the age of your dying. You also want to feel healthy at the moment that you're living, of course. So there have also been many studies looking at other aspects of health. And for instance, there's one study looking at wound healing. We've done some experiments in that area as well. So in that case, in an experimental situation, some superficial wounds are created on purpose on the arm. And you can measure a standardized size, and you can measure how long it takes before the wound heals. And it has been found, we did some other studies with that, but in another study, which was not ours, it has been found that the higher the level of optimism, the faster the wounds heal. And that's also has to do with your immune system. Your immune system is very important for wound healing. And cortisol and immune system are also related. So it has an impact on wound healing. It also has an impact on the chances of attracting a virus, like the common cold. So in the United States, in Pittsburgh, you have a common cold unit, and they do a lot of studies on who is most prone to be infected by a virus. So people come into the unit, they get the virus inserted into the nose, so they're deliberately infected by a rhinovirus. And then they see who actually is going to develop a cold. Because even if you attract the virus and spray it in your nose, it's only about 25 to 30%, or maybe a little more, to 40%, which actually develops a cold in the end. And they did find that the higher the level of optimism, the less likely you are attracting the cold, even if you are affected. So again, the immune system probably plays a role here. And finally, there's also some research on vaccination. And I guess you're familiar with vaccines. If you get a vaccine, you need to have an antibody response so that your body is prepared to fighting a virus when it actually encounters you. So you need a good antibody response after your vaccination. And what was found, that was indeed that the people who are highly or more optimistic had a higher antibody response. So the least optimistic people hardly had an antibody response to the virus, and so they did not have so much protection against the real virus when they got in touch with it. So there are many reasons, not only on longevity, but on various aspects of health where optimism helps for. But this is an important aspect. We, of course, always have the chicken and egg problem. So are people more healthy because they're optimistic, or are they more optimistic because they're in better health? And even though many of the studies try to control for already the health status at the moment, it's impossible to control for everything. And also when you follow up people in time, you could say, okay, we measured optimism 10 years ago and now someone gets a disease, so probably there is a connection. But you can never know for sure, because it can also be another, a third factor which determines that. For instance, your genes, and maybe the same genes that makes you optimistic are also the genes which make sure that you have a good and healthy life. So if we want to really say something about causality, what you actually would need, what the most strongest evidence would be, if we could make people more optimistic and see whether that has an impact on the same outcomes as being optimistic by yourself. So that's what we try to do. And that's actually what I've devoted last year's quite some time to. And first of all, you need to find something to make people more optimistic, even if it's temporarily, but then you can use it for lab studies. So when I started out, I think it's probably 15 years ago, I went to the literature and I was looking, are there some techniques of making people more optimistic? And I didn't find anything. But I did find a technique. No, let's skip this. Okay, I did find a technique which was used in making people feel more positive mood. Not necessarily optimism, but more positive mood. What they did, they had people write about their best possible self in the future, so that everything has gone well and all your dreams have come true. And I thought when I read that, okay, that sounds very much like optimism. You think about the future, you think positive about it, you attain your goals. So I said, maybe we can use this for increasing optimism. But I also added a visualization or imagery component to that. Because we know from other research that visualizing yourself in a certain circumstances has more impact on your emotions and your cognitions than only writing about it. So really visualization, having pictures of it. So we did that, we tried that, we've tried it now I think 20 or 30 times, and we indeed find that after such an exercise, compared to a control exercise where people just write and imagine some neutral situation, that people become more optimistic, at least for the time being. But we can use it as a tool in the lab then. We've also done it in many different circumstances. In this study, for instance, we had people of various ages, men and women, and we specifically selected 50 participants in every age group, because we thought, well, maybe it works in young people, because they still have their whole life open to them, but maybe it will not work in the oldest people, because yeah, they've already had such a long life. But it was as effective in the young as it was in the old. And also education didn't matter. If we controlled for education, it also worked in the lower and the higher educated people. The only circumstances where we did not find an effect of optimism, our optimism intervention, was when we applied it, and we've done it twice now, in China. Apparently, there are cultural differences. It works well in European people. We do it in the Netherlands, but my colleagues do it in Germany, in Spain, some different countries, the United States. But in China, so maybe in Asian countries, there will be cultural differences, and it did not work. So there might, that might be a drawback of this technique. We also wanted to see whether we can have a little bit more of lasting impact. So in this study, we had people write just once, but for 2 weeks in a row, they imagined this bright future 5 minutes a day. So very short exercise. And this was, again, the control intervention, where they just had a neutral exercise. Here you can see that after 1 week, it was already significantly increased, the level of actually trait optimism. And 2 weeks later, it was further increased. So it can have a bit more lasting impact. We stopped measuring after 2 weeks, so we don't know whether it lasted, but at least for a time being, we can make people a bit more optimistic. So very briefly, did we indeed find the same impact as trait optimism if we make people more optimistic? Well, we know that optimists can stand pain better, so they have a higher pain tolerance. So we also did that with our manipulation, and indeed we found that if we have people insert their hands in ice water, they experience it as less painful if we made them first more optimistic. We also did an eye tracking study. Trait optimistic people tend to look more on positive images, have an attentional bias for positive images compared to negative images. If we make people more optimistic beforehand, they also seek out more happy faces compared to sad faces or angry faces. And this is one I wanted to focus on. What we also did was exhaust people, make them very tired, and then give them a cognitive task. Because, as I said in the beginning, optimists persist despite challenges they face, despite stressors, they persist longer. So we wanted to know, if we make people more optimistic ourselves, can they also persist better? So this is what it looked like. We used, again, the cold water test. So people, until tolerance, put their hands in ice water, and that drains your energy. You should try it. It's nasty. So if you do it for 2 minutes, you're really tired from it. And then we gave people a computer task, which they had a working memory performance. And we measured how well they performed. So in the control group, which we did not make optimistic, this was the normal performance. So this is how many they had correct, how many answers they had correct. So it was almost 80% correct answers. But if we first gave them this called pressure test, it dropped to, 68%. So they really performed less well. If we made them more optimistic, with the best possible self-condition exercise, you see, nothing happened. They could still perform as well as they could without without the pain. Well, we actually replicated it with another pain stimulus, with another task, and we found exactly the same thing. We also made people very tired with giving them a lot of cognitive tasks, and then they had to perform a physical task, and we also found the same thing. They could still do the physical task despite being very fatigued. And then finally, does it have an impact on stress? Because that's what we actually were thinking about. If you want to know if it can have a causal relationship to your health, you need to know, and that's of course very difficult to research in the lab. We cannot in an instant make people more healthy, but we can look at how the body responds to stress. So this is actually a relatively complicated experiment. So first people filled in questionnaires, and also they kept a diary which they scored how much stress they experience in daily life. And they also had cotton swabs to collect saliva, which we analyzed for the level of cortisol, so the stress hormone. Then they went home, did nothing, and 2 weeks later, in weeks 3 and 4, they did either the best possible self exercise or the control exercise. And then they filled in the questionnaires again, the diary again, and also we had the cortisol collection. So what we found was that indeed, compared to the control condition, in the best possible self condition, on the questionnaires people say that they worried less about their life. In the diaries they said they experienced less stress. And also, at the awakening, the cortisol, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with it, but if you wake up, there's a sudden rise in your cortisol level. And then it drops again during the day. And this rise in cortisol in the morning is often taken as a measure of your stress reactivity. And what we found was after the best possible self, indeed, this awakening response was significantly less. And then what we also did was having people to the lab, indeed giving them this social stressor and collecting cortisol during the stress task and before and after the stress task every 5 minutes. We had in between, we had the intervention, and then they came back 4 weeks later and did the same stress task. So this was the control group, which we did not make optimistic. And you can see here we have this nice cortisol response. So here's the stressor, then it peaks, and then it drops again. And the second time they came into the lab 4 weeks later, you can see it's almost the same response. It is a little lower, but not significant. Well, you can see it immediately here in our best possible self condition. The first time they came in, they had this nice stress response. The second time, it was much lower and significantly lower. So we can have an impact on also the physiological responses, showing that, because there cannot be another explanation here in the sense that people were randomly going to one group or to the other group, assigned to a certain condition. So there are no a priori differences in optimism, because it's random, but making them optimism has an impact on your body functioning, so probably this says something about the causality. I see that I'm over time, so just one word on clinical relevance. We have published a lot on this, and people have taken it up, and if people talk about optimism, they often refer to our work and say, well, we have a technique making people more optimistic. But I have to say, we developed this as a research tool. And I'm not so sure whether we can actually have a lasting impact, a real life-changing experience. So I have to be honest on that. And the only thing I want to say about it is that so far we do not know whether it can go beyond the time that you're doing it. But if you mix it with other techniques, with other positive psychology exercises, or maybe more normal cognitive behavioral techniques, then it might have a lasting impact. So I will not go into this because time-wise, but we did one study in chronic pain patients, and indeed, in a mixture of different kind of positive psychology exercises, we did find that we could increase optimism immediately afterwards, but also 6 months later. And also, Also, the level of depression was reduced until 6 months later. So I think it can have a lasting impact, but together with other things you are doing, other intervention techniques. So this brings me to the end. Optimism, I think it's largely determined in the youth, partly genetic, but partly by your early life experiences. But nevertheless, there might be change. Change is possible. It has various benefits, and I think our experiments and also now experiments of others have shown that it might be a causal connection, that it's not only because you are more healthy that it influences your optimism, but that is also the other way around. That brings me to the end, so there's some time for questions, I hope.
Thank you, Madelon. And indeed, we have some time for questions. Before I look at the room, I was curious to hear myself. Of course, you've made a strong plea here for being optimistic. We've seen in our audience and also from your data, there are, of course, quite a lot of pessimistic or more pessimistic people as well. Is pessimism always bad?
Sorry,
is pessimism always bad?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we need a variety of people, of course, in our life, and I'm not sure whether there's not so many research showing the beneficial effects of pessimism, but. Sorry? Bombers in the Second World War. Okay. I didn't know that. I was actually thinking, but I was
less health related, maybe. But
it's less health related. Well, it's health related for the people on the ground, but.
But for example,
but I was thinking more on the philosophical side and on the art side. There is some connection between for instance, for literature and also for some artworks, where people, especially which are more on the depressive or pessimistic side, have better artworks. So there might be some benefits. Yeah. But I'm more interested in the benefits of optimism, I have to say.
And when you look at its relation to realism, because my personal annoyance with very optimistic people is sometimes that I feel that they've lost sight of reality a little bit.
Yeah. Well, there's a risk. I think there is a balance. At some point, it can go over to unrealistic thinking, and that's not good. I mean, if you, for instance, think I will always win the lottery and or win in gambling games, and you're too optimistic, you might spend too much money on that. Or, for instance, for climate change, we need some kind of realism and maybe also a kind of pessimism. That things are going on, but optimism is also the feeling that you can do something about it, and if it turns to helplessness, so pessimistic that you don't do anything anymore, then it also is detrimental. Yep. So I think there might be a balance. You should not be over-optimistic, but you should have a realistic optimism. Okay, thanks. Good to know. Questions in the room for Madelon? I see one up front. We have the catch box. If you could speak in the catch box in the... black thing, yeah, great. Like this?
All right. Yeah, my question is, I saw the graphs and stuff, and now I'm really curious, how do you measure optimism? And what is 10, 18, 22 on that scale? Yeah. It's a very good question, because I didn't go into it. How do I measure optimism? There is a questionnaire. The most well-known questionnaire is called the Life Orientation Test. And it has actually only 6 questions, which very directly ask how optimistic you feel. I always see the bright side, even if in bad circumstances. So 6 of these questions, and on a 5-point scale, so it can go from 10 to 40 or something, and everyone is somewhere on this dimension. So it's just a self-report questionnaire. Of course, there's no, like always in psychology, there's no objective measure. You cannot measure in the brain your level of optimism, so you always have to ask people.
Right. Thanks. Questions further at the back? Yeah, okay, if you could throw it all the way to the person at the back. You can use someone in between.
Yeah, I'll just throw it over.
Yeah, let's see where it... Go ahead.
All right, so I was curious because the first 2 studies, large-scale studies you mentioned, had primarily female participants. Was there a particular reason for that?
Not a particular reason, but those data were available. It's belongs to the Women Health Study, and in the United States, a lot of money was going into women's health. So they followed up with several questionnaires this large group of women, and that's why. And they took this data to also research this connection with optimism. So it was just because it was available.
Is there any data in general about differences between male and females that you know of?
Yeah, there is data about it, that there's no difference. Women and men are, there's difference between men and women, but not in the level of optimism.
They're equally optimistic.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope that comforts you a little bit. I'm afraid we are running out of time. So if you have any further questions, perhaps you can come up to Madelon after the lecture. Madelon, thanks again very much for being here today, sharing your insights on optimism.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have some time, please fill out our questionnaire. And we hope to see you again next time at Studium Generale.